This is a story of two parts. The first is my own story, told from the perspective of my 11-year-old self, while the second part is told from that of my late father's. In September of 1989, just after my 11th birthday, my parents loaded up all of our stuff into a car and moved us all the way from Pennsylvania, steel country, to Rhode Island. The move was sudden, to say the least, and neither myself nor my older sister were particularly happy about it. But Mom explained that Dad had secured a very good job out there and we could use the extra money to buy us new bikes, horse riding lessons, and all that good stuff. You get the idea. So we get there, and the house was amazing. It was brand new, but still looked super old and fancy, and according to my parents, the best thing was that it was free. The house was provided for anyone who held the position my dad had recently acquired, which was the vice principal of the very fancy private school we'd be going to. That didn't really mean much to us kids, though. We were more than swayed by the promise of new bikes, but the thing that really won us over were our new bedrooms. They were huge compared to our old rooms, and when Mom and Dad said that we could help furnish them ourselves on a little trip into Newport, me and my sister were walking on air. We'd gone from very unhappy about the move to positively ecstatic, but as time went on, things started to seem really, really off. The first thing I noticed was how our new place was compared to all the other homes and buildings around the township. The place was nothing but old money New England elite, and it had the architecture to match. Most homes dated back to the 1800s, and some of the older cottages were built back to the 1680s. We weren't exactly complaining about that. Better to live in some new build than some rickety old cottage, no matter how storied it was. But the contrast was something that we picked up on as time went by. The second thing I noticed was the way people looked at our house whenever they passed. I remember looking out of my dad's office window one day when I spotted a kid riding down our street on his little Redline BMX, the exact same kind of bike I wanted. Our house was one of only 3 on that street, all real big houses nicely spaced out. So when he slowed to a stop outside of ours, I found myself hoping that he was about to come and kind of hit up the new kid in the town, which might allow me to try out my dream bike way earlier than expected. But then, instead of getting off of his bike and walking up to our driveway, the kid just stared at our house with this real nervous look on his face. I started to wave, and I quickly managed to get his attention, but instead of waving back or anything, the kid jumped right back on his bike and went back the way he came, as if I'd suddenly spooked him or something. I honestly figured that it was a me problem, that the kids at school were going to treat me like an outcast or something, and it really bummed me out. But as I came to find out, what was spooking that kid was nothing to do with me. It was the house. Speaking of school, I didn't notice the third weird thing until me and my sister had started classes. The kids didn't treat me like a leper, and to my infinite relief, they were actually pretty welcoming. At least until they found out who I was and where I lived, and that's when I started acting strange. 2 things seemed to trigger the reaction, either mentioning where we'd moved into or mentioning what my dad's new job was. I'd be talking to some kid, get along with them, making a friend, and they'd just switch whenever I'd mention the job or the house. They wouldn't exactly run away screaming or anything, but there'd always be a noticeable shift in their attitude towards me. And that continued for weeks, until I finally found out what had happened up at that house. It took an unusually long time for us kids to find out, but that was down to almost everyone in town adhering to an unofficial code of silence. But that didn't last, though, and weirdly enough, the kids lasted longer than the adults did. I guess that's just because they knew less about it, but they still knew that it was bad, and bad enough they didn't need to have some moratorium imposed on them. They just didn't want to discuss it at all. Until finally, a kid I'd made friends with told me the truth of why our house was so new and why some folks stopped and stared whenever they walked by. About 6 months before we'd moved in, there had been a fire at the old vice principal's house. The only survivor had been the guy's wife, while the VP and his 3 children had all sadly lost their lives. Everyone had decided that the place was haunted, so instead of just fixing the place up, it was torn down entirely before a new house was built in its place. At least, that's what my buddy told me. And in case it wasn't obvious from the whole haunted thing, that wasn't quite how things happened. My dad, on the other hand, he got the full story, something he soon passed along to my mom, and once us kids found out the half story, it triggered a kind of crisis. We didn't want to stay there anymore, convinced that the ghosts of the old VP and his 3 kids were wandering the halls at night, and Mom wasn't going to keep us there if we were going to end up sleepless and traumatized. And that's how my parents ended up separating for a while, at least, until the bad juju in that house got to Dad too, and we ended up getting a place in Newport with my dad commuting to and from school. I didn't find out what really happened in that house until many years later, and when I did, I wondered how my dad could have slept in that place alone for a single night, ghosts or not. According to him, the whole story starts with this kid named Freddie Washbach. Freddie was a rich kid, but that didn't mean that he was immune to regular old teenage angst. He was into heavy metal, he stole his sister's nail polish, and spent most of his time hanging out with other punks over in the city. He wasn't just the black sheep of his family, he was the black sheep of the whole township by the sounds of things, and he was forever falling foul of the late vice principal, as they would say. This vice principal had apparently taken a personal interest in straightening out young Freddie, and whenever his behavior started to slip, he'd called Freddie into his office for an impromptu disciplinary action. Apparently, this continued for an extended period of time, and Freddie's behavior did actually improve somewhat. But as it did, Freddie became increasingly withdrawn. His parents were overjoyed at the improvement and apparently saw his sort of melancholy attitude as a form of emotional growing pains. They figured that he'd be over his little rebellious phase in time for college applications and all that, but neither Freddie nor the former vice principal ever made it that far. One night, Freddie Washbach walked all the way over to the former VP's house and knocked on the door. When the VP came to the door, Freddie produced a shotgun, then ordered the VP and his family into their TV room. Once they were all present and secured, Freddie took out a cassette tape, slid it into the VP's stereo system, and pressed play. It wasn't the only copy of the tape. Freddie had posted the original to the chief of the Newport Police Department. He wanted the truth to come out, but as for the punishment, he was content to handle that himself. Freddie made the VP's family listen to a secret recording he'd made, one which documented the events of one of his disciplinary sessions. I don't know the exact details of it, no one really does, but it's safe to say Freddie was being subjected to some of the most horrifying and venal abuse imaginable. Then, once the whole family, including the children, had heard what a soulless monster their father and husband had been, Freddie Washbach opened fire. He made sure to wing the VP and his wife. He wanted to make sure that they watched their kids die. Then, once their kids were gone, Washbach fired another few shells at the parents, and then set the house on fire, and then turned the shotgun on himself. Yet in focusing most of his rage on his abuser, Freddie had neglected to ensure that the VP's wife was dead. Somehow, she managed to drag the bodies of all 3 of her dead children out of the burning house and onto the lawn outside. She didn't once try to go back in for her husband. She just let his body burn, along with that of young Freddie Washbach's. After giving the police a full and frank account of what had happened, leaving them in no doubt of her husband's true nature, the late VP's wife simply skipped town and was never to be seen again. The townsfolk had the place bulldozed and rebuilt, then spent the next 6 months or so pretending the whole thing never happened. Then finally, they placed a few ads for the vice principal's position, and that's where we enter the story. As it turns out, Mom and Dad were basically getting the same sort of treatment as we were. Everyone was all nice and friendly with them right up until the subject of work or home came up, and then just like the kids at school, they'd start acting all cagey and shifty. The school basically refused to answer any of the questions Dad had regarding his predecessor and only told him stuff like he wasn't suited to the role. We were months into living there when my dad finally confronted the principal and demanded that he tell him what was going on, and that's when he found out why the salary was so generous. It was a well-paid position as it was, but the salary had been marked up as a kind of unwritten don't ask and don't tell rule, one that turned into a keep your mouth shut rule once he found out. The school had somehow managed to keep the whole thing out of the papers, at least the truth of the matter anyway, and although they claimed it was for the family's protection, their only interest was their own reputation. That's what really pushed my dad to leave in the end. Not what had happened or the fact that he was living over the site of such a horrific past event. It was the fact that the school wasn't prepared to put any kind of preventative safety measures in place, because that would force them to actually acknowledge what had happened. The way Dad put it, it's one thing to try to move on from a sudden tragedy, but it's another to refuse to put any safeguards in place and risk the same thing happening again. It was like the school saw it as the mess cleaning up itself sort of thing, and they refused to accept that anything like that could possibly happen again. Washbach and the VP were unique cases, a perfect alignment of disasters waiting to happen, and no amount of safeguarding could prevent it from reoccurring. It was a disgustingly fatalistic way for a school to approach such an event, and in the end, no amount of money could have kept my dad there, and at the end of his first year, he quit before taking a job near Hartford. Me and my sister remained in the dark until many years afterwards when he finally told us what had happened in that little Rhode Island township. I'm surprised the whole story still hasn't hit the news. You think some journalists would have found out about it by now and have the whole thing written up for the Times or the Post. But then the more I think about it, the more I realize that it's down to me to write it up. I guess this will serve as a kind of test, to see if I have the chops to actually tell the story right, and if it all works out then, I guess I know what I'm going to do with my spare time for the foreseeable future. If you enjoyed this scary story, listen to thousands more, either over on the Let's Read YouTube channel or podcast.